Page 94, top, chapter 6. I saw myself just hanging there among bolts of cloth, among Sunday hats and shoes, among men's and women's undergarments, among pots and pans, among brooms and household soap, among notebooks and pens and ink, among medicines for curing headache and medicines for curing colds. I saw myself among all these things, but I didn't know that it was I, for I had got so strange. My whole head was so big, and my eyes, which were too big, sat in my big head wide open, as if I had just had a sudden fright. My skin was black in a way I had not noticed before, as if someone had thrown a lot of soot out a window just when I was passing by, and it had all fallen on me. On my forehead, on my cheeks, were little bumps, each with a perfect round white point. My plaits stuck out in every direction from my hat. My long thin neck stuck out from my blouse of my uniform, although altogether I looked old and miserable. Not long before I had seen a picture of a painting entitled The Young Lucifer. It showed Satan just recently cast out of heaven for all of his bad deeds, and he was standing on a black rock all alone and naked. Everything around him was charred and black, as if a great fire had just roared through. His skin was coarse, and so were his features. His hair was made up of live snakes, and they were in a position to strike. Satan was wearing a smile, but it was one of those smiles that you could see through. One of those smiles that made you know the person is just putting up a good front. At heart, you could see he was really lonely and miserable at the way things had turned out. I was standing there surprised at this change in myself when all of this came to mind, and suddenly I felt so sorry for myself that I was about to sit down on the sidewalk and weep, already tasting the salty bitterness of my tears. I was about to do this when I noticed 4 boys standing across the street from me. They were looking at me and bowing, as they said in an exaggerated tone of voice, pretending to be grown-up gentlemen living in Victorian times, "Hello, madame, how are you this afternoon?" And "What a pleasant thing, our running into each other like this." And "We meet again after all this time." And "Ah, the sun, it shines and shines only on you." The words were no sooner out of their mouths than they would bend over laughing. Even though nothing like this had ever happened to me before, I knew instantly that it was malicious, and that I had done nothing to deserve it other than standing there all alone. They were older than I, and from their uniforms I could tell that they were students at the boys' branch of my own school. I looked at their faces. I didn't recognize the first. I didn't recognize the second. I didn't recognize the third. But I knew the face of the fourth one. It was a face from my ancient history. A long time ago, when we were little children, our mothers were best friends, and he and I used to play together. His name was Minu, and I felt pleased that he, an older boy than I by 3 years, would play with me. Of course, in all the games we played, I was given the lesser part. If we played Knight and Dragon, I was the dragon. If we played Discovering Africa, he discovered Africa. He was also the leader of the savage tribes that tried to get in the way of the discovery, and I played his servant, and not a very bright servant at all. If we played Prodigal Son, he was the prodigal son and the prodigal son's father and the jealous brother, while I played a person who fetched things. Once in a game we were playing, something terrible happened. A man had recently killed his girlfriend and a man who was his best friend when he found them drinking together in a bar. Their blood splattered all over him. The cutlass he had used to kill them in hand, he walked the mile or so to the police station, and with the other customers of the bar and some people they picked up along the way, the murder of these 2 people immediately became a big scandal, and the most popular calypso song that year was all about it. It became a big scandal because the murderer was from an old, well-off, respected family, and everybody wondered if he would be hanged, which was the penalty for murder. Also, it became a scandal because everyone had known the woman and all had predicted that she would come to a bad end. Everything about this soon became a spectacle. During the funerals of the murdered man and woman, people lined the streets and followed the hearses from the church to the cemetery. During the trial of the murderer, the courtroom was always packed. When the judge sentenced the man to be hanged, the whole courtroom gasped in shock. On the morning that he was hanged, people gathered outside the jail and waited until the jail's church bell rang. showing that the hanging was completed. Manu and I had overheard our parents talk so much about this event that it wasn't long before he made up a game about it. As usual, Manu played all the big parts. He played the murdered man and the murderer, going back and forth. The girlfriend we left silent. When the case got to court, Manu played judge, jury, prosecutor, and condemned man. Sitting in the condemned man's box, nothing was funnier than seeing him using some old rags as a wig for his part of the judge. Pass sentence on himself. Nothing was funnier than seeing him as the drunken hangman hanging himself. And after he was hanged, I, as his mother, came and wept over the body as it lay on the ground. Then we would get up and start the whole thing over again. No sooner had we completed the episode than we were back at the bar, with Manu quarreling with himself and his girlfriend, and then putting an end to everything with a few quick strokes. We always tried to make every detail as close to the real thing as we imagined, and so we had gone to the trouble of finding old furniture to make a desk for the judge and a place for the jury to sit, and we set out some stones facing the judge to represent both where the spectators might sit and the spectators themselves. When it came to the hanging, we wanted that to be real too, so Manu had found a piece of rope and tied it to the top bar of the gate to his yard. And then we would make a noose and put his head in it. When the noose was around his neck, he would grab the rope from above and then swing on it back and forth to show that he was hanged and already dead. All of our playing together came to an end when something bad almost happened. We were playing in the usual way when we came to the part of the noose around the neck. When he lifted himself off the ground, the noose tightened. When he let go of the rope to loosen the noose with his hands, that only made matters worse, and the noose tightened even more. His mouth opened as he tried to get breath, and then his tongue began to come out of his mouth. His body, hanging from the gate, began to swing back and forth, and as it did, it banged against the gate, and it made a sound as if he were swinging on the gate, the very thing we were always being told not to do. As all this happened, I just stood there and stared. I must have known that I should go and call for help, but I was unable to move. Slam, slam went the gate, and soon his mother began to call out, "Children, leave the gate alone." Then, hearing the gate continue to slam, she came out to us in a fury because we were not obeying her, and she was just about to shout at us when she saw her child swinging from the gate by his neck. She screamed and rushed over to him, calling out to a neighbor, who came immediately with a cutlass and cut the rope from around Manu's neck. When his mother came and started to scream, only then could I scream too, and I ran over to him with her, and we both cried out over him as he fell to the ground. Much was said about my not calling for help, and everybody wondered what would have happened if his mother hadn't been nearby. I didn't know what to make of my own behavior, and I could not explain myself, as everybody kept asking me to do. I could see that even my mother was ashamed of the way I had behaved. It was this that I remembered as I saw Manu's face across the street. And so I walked over and said in my best, most polite young lady voice, "Hello, Manu, I am so glad to see you. Don't you remember me?" It was true that I was glad to see him, for just remembering all the things that he and I used to do reminded me of how happy I had been, and how much my mother and everyone else adored me, and how, when looking at me, people used to say, "What a beautiful child." At first, he just looked at me, and then he said, "Oh, yes, Annie John. I remember you. I had heard you were a big girl now." As he said this, he shook my outstretched hand. His friends stood off to one side a little bit apart from us. They stood in that ridiculous way of boys, one leg crossing the other, hands jammed deep into pockets, eyes looking you up and down. They were whispering things to each other, and their shoulders were heaving with amusement at me, I could only suppose. I thought that since he was someone I knew, he couldn't really be like them, but as we stood, more or less speechless, in front of each other, I saw him glancing at them out of the corner of his eye, smiling in a knowing way, and then looking back straight at me, a serious look on his face. Feeling ashamed, for I could tell that they were making fun of me, I said to him, "Well, goodbye then," and I offered him my hand again. He and his friends walked off, their backs shaking with laughter, at me, no doubt. As I watched them, I wished that right there I could turn them into cinder blocks, so that one moment, if you were walking behind them, you were walking behind four boys, and the next moment you had to be careful not to stumble over some cinder blocks. feeling that in this whole incident, Manu had been cruel, made me remember something. It was the last time that we had played together, in a game we were making up on the spot. I took off all my clothes, and he led me to a spot under a tree where I was to sit until he told me what to do next. It wasn't long before I realized that the spot he picked out was a red ant's nest. Soon the angry ants were all over me, stinging me in my private parts, and as I cried and scratched, trying to get the ants off me, he fell down on the ground laughing, his feet kicking in the air with happiness. His mother refused to admit that he had done something wrong, and my mother never spoke to her again. I walked home, cutting through the churchyard of the Methodist church, my own church, except for two lizards chasing each other across my path. I wasn't aware of anything on the outside. Inside, however, the thimble that weighed worlds spun around and around. As it spun, it bumped up against my heart, my chest, my stomach, and whatever it touched felt as if I had been scorched there. I thought that I had better get home quickly, for I began to feel alternately too big and too small. First, I grew so big that I took up the whole street. Then, I grew so small that nobody could see me, not even if I cried out. I walked into our yard, and I could see my mother standing in the kitchen, her back toward me, bent over a bowl in which she was putting some green figs, their skins removed. I walked up to her and I said, "Good afternoon, Mommy. I have just come home from school." My mother turned to face me. We looked at each other, and I could see the frightening black thing leave her to meet the frightening black thing that had left me. They met in the middle and embraced. "What will it be now?" I asked myself. To me, she said, "You're late. If it would please me to hear an excuse from you." She was using that tone of voice. It was as if I were not only a stranger, but a stranger that she did not wish to know. Trying to match her tone of voice, but coming nowhere near success, I said something about being kept late for extra studies. I then went on to say that my teachers believed that if I studied hard enough, by my 16th birthday, I might be able to take final exams and so be able to leave school. As if she knew exactly that what I would come up with, such a story, she said, "Perhaps if I ask again, this time I will get a straight answer." I was about to make a feeble effort at protest, but then, in a rush, she said that she had been standing inside a store that afternoon buying some buttons for a Sunday dress for me. When on looking up, she observed me making a spectacle of myself in front of 4 boys. She went on to say, after all the years she had spent drumming into me the proper way to conduct myself when speaking to young men, it had pained her to see me behave in the manner of a slut, only she used the French patois word for it, in the street, and that just to see me had caused her to feel shame. The word slut in patois was repeated over and over, until suddenly I felt as if I were drowning in a well, but instead of the well being filled with water, it was filled with the word slut, and it was pouring in through my eyes, my ears, my nostrils, my mouth. As if to save myself, I turned to her and said, "Well, like father, like son, like mother, like daughter." At that, everything stopped. The whole earth fell silent. The 2 black things joined together in the middle of the room, separated, hers going to her, mine coming back to me. I looked at my mother. She seemed tired and old and broken. Seeing that, I felt happy and sad at the same time. I soon decided that happy was better, and I was just about to enjoy this feeling when she said, "Until this moment, in my whole life, I knew without a doubt, without any exception, I loved you best." And then she turned her back and started again to prepare the green figs for cooking. I looked at my mother, at her turned back this time, and she wasn't tired and old and broken at all. She wore her hair pinned up in the same beautiful way, exposing the nape of her beautiful neck. Her bent over back looked strong and soft at the same time, and I wanted to go and rest my whole body on it the way I used to. Her long skirt covered her beautiful strong legs, and she wore shoes that exposed beautiful heels. It was I who was tired and old and broken, and as I looked at my mother full of vigor, young and whole, I wanted to go over and put my arms around her and beg forgiveness for the thing I had just said, and to explain that I didn't really mean it, but I couldn't move. And when I looked down, it was as if the ground had opened up between us, making a deep and wide split. On one side of this split stood my mother, bent over my dinner, cooking in a pot. On the other side, I stood I, in my arms carrying my schoolbooks, and inside carrying the thimble that weighed worlds. I went to my room to take off my school uniform, but I could only sit on my bed and wonder what would become of me now. As I sat, I looked at the things surrounding me. There was my washstand, made for me by my father from pitch pine, and its enamel basin on top, and matching urn filled with water underneath. There was my bureau, made for me by my father from pitch pine, and in it were my clothes. There was a shelf made for me by my father from pitch pine, on which I kept my books. The very bed I sat on was made for me by my father from pitch pine. There was a little desk and chair to match, at which I sat and read or did my homework, both made for me by my father from pitch pine. Each time my father had bought the wood for the furniture, he had taken me to the lumber yard with him, and I saw how he examined every piece of wood carefully before he accepted it for purchase. He would hold it first to his nostrils, then to my own, and he would say, "Nothing like a nice piece of pine, except perhaps a nice piece of mahogany." Then I was not allowed to see the furniture in any stage until it was in its place in my room. It would be a surprise then for me to see it, and I would say to my father, "I see I have a new chair." And he would say, "I see you have a new chair." And then we would embrace, I kissing him on the cheek and he kissing me on the forehead. It used to be that when my father wanted me to kiss him, he would have to bend down to reach my forehead. Now in the last year I had grown so much that it was I who had to bend down to see so that my father could reach my forehead. My mother was taller than my father now. I was too. Was taller than my father. I was in fact as tall as my mother. When my mother and I spoke to each other, we looked at each other eye to eye. Eye to eye. It was the first time such a thing had come to me. My mother and I were eye to eye. For a moment I was happy at the thought, but then I could see. What did such a thing matter? She was my mother, Annie. I was her daughter, Annie, and that was why I was called by my mother and father Little Miss. Sitting on my bed and thinking in this way, I swung my feet back and forth, and it was a while before I realized that when they swung back, my feet would hit up against the trunk stored under my bed. It was the trunk that my mother had bought when she was 16 years old, a year older than I was now, and in which she had packed all her things and left not only her parents' house in Dominica, but Dominica itself for Antigua. Her father and she had a big quarrel over whether she would live alone, as she wished, or would continue to live in her parents' house as her father wished. Her mother, who had stopped speaking to her father a long time before, though they continued to live in the same house, didn't say anything one way or the other. My mother and her father had had a big quarrel, and though my mother had never told me in detail the whole story, I had pieced it together from things I had overheard, just putting two and two together in my usual way. Inside this trunk now were the things, all of them, that had been a part of my life at every stage. And if someone had come upon it without having an inkling of what my life really had been like, they would have gotten a pretty good idea. As my heels bumped up against the trunk, my heart just broke, and I cried and cried. At that moment, I missed my mother more than I had ever imagined possible, and wanted only to live somewhere quiet and beautiful with her alone. But also at that moment I wanted only to see her lying dead, all withered and in a coffin at my feet. The moments soon passed, and I got up from my bed to change my clothes and carry out my afternoon chores. My mother and I avoided each other, and it wasn't until over our supper of the green figs cooked with fish and coconut milk that we looked at each other again. We did our best to keep up appearances for my father's sake, but our two black things got the better of us, and even though we didn't say anything noticeable, it was clear that something was amiss. Perhaps to cheer us up, my father said that he would finally make for my mother the set of furniture she had been asking him to make for a very long time now. In fact, the set of furniture had been a bone of contention between them. That brought a half-hearted, polite smile to my mother's face. Then turning to me, my father asked what he could make for me. It came into my mind without thinking. A trunk. I said. But you have a trunk already. You have your mother's trunk, he said to me. Yes, but I want my own trunk, I said back. Very well. A trunk is your request. A trunk you will have, he said. Out of the corner of one eye, I could see my mother. Out of the corner of the other eye, I could see her shadow on the wall, cast there by the lamplight. It was a big and solid shadow, and it looked so much like my mother that I became frightened, for I could not be sure whether for the rest of my life I would be able to tell when it was really my mother and when it was really her shadow standing between me and the rest of the world.